Like many gamers, I started playing video games when I was a kid. I remember going to the local 7-Eleven and dropping a couple of quarters into the big arcade gaming console so I could try my hand at Asteroids, Space Invaders, Donkey Kong, and Pac-Man. Once I started playing, I was glued to the machine, eyes focused on the flashing images flying across the big black screen, hands frantically and simultaneously punching the red button so I could fire and turning the red knob so I could aim my line-shaped battleship or round yellow gobbling Pac-Man. As I grew older, one of my sisters introduced me to Ms. Magazine, and after devouring her magazine, the iconic issue with Wonder Woman on the cover, and listening to her as she talked politics, I began my journey towards feminism. So, when Ms. Pac-Man came to the arcades, my adolescent self was happy. Never mind her claim to fame relies on highly gendered sexuality that took shape in the form of her ginormous pink bow, high-heeled pumps, and saucy legs seductively crossed at the knees. She was a girl protagonist, and she rocked. Somewhere along the way, I removed myself, or more accurately, was removed from video games. I suppose it was because as the industry grew, the games likewise grew. But my beloved games morphed into a very male-centric industry. While I wanted to keep playing my Asteroids, Space Invaders, and Ms. Pac-Man, other kids, primarily boys, flocked to the aggressive games of Street Fighter and Kung Fu. Sure, there were other games like The Legend of Zelda that weren't as aggressive, but I began to notice that these new narrative-based games were featuring a lot of male protagonists. I began to ask, where were the girls? One of the more problematic games, Custer's Revenge, had female characters, but definitely not as protagonists. Even though I never played this game, the fact that it was created and played by others, along with its content, offended me so much that 1982, the year of Custer's Revenge, was the turning point of my video game love affair. I became disenfranchised with the video game industry. In Custer's Revenge, the way for Custer, the male protagonist, to score points was to rape a Native American woman. Even though the company who made this game eventually went out of business and was bought out by another company, Custer's Revenge was later tweaked by the new owner to give the once Native American woman darker skin and to have her beckon to Custer so that she seemed to request the rape. I realized that the woman's body, especially the minority woman's body, had become a commodified landscape for the male protagonists to plunder, all in the name of video game entertainment. I saw all of this, perhaps not on a sophisticated level, but I saw it nonetheless. True, Custer's Revenge was marketed as an adult video game, but I remember wondering what the hell was going on in this video game industry that I had been falling in love with. And in my late teens, the time when I started thinking about what I might study in college, I left technology and playing video games behind. Fast forward about 12 years to when I'm a newly married woman, a new mom, and holder of 2 degrees in English, a field that, at the time, was far removed from technology and video games. My husband is a tech wizard, a man whom I lovingly and half-jokingly call a computer god, a tech god, a cyber god. He's also a gamer, and he reawakened my love for video games. I came to love playing Mr. Bones on our Sega Genesis and Space Invaders on our Super NES. Being the tech wizard that he is, my husband downloaded my old arcade favorites of Asteroids, Galaga, and the Pac-Man family for me on our gaming computer. When our 5-year-old son was in his Barney phase, I enjoyed getting out my pathological dislike of Barney through the Wolfenstein Barney mod, a fabulous shoot-'em-up game where Barney the Purple Dinosaur was my target. But all of these games didn't have substantive narrative. They're simple point-and-click or shoot-'em-up games. If they had a narrative, the narrative was tenuous at best. Nevertheless, my immersion in the world of video games started changing my perception and understanding of rhetoric. The older I got and the more I played video games, the more I came to see the nuances and finer points of visual and auditory rhetoric, of the narrative being told through images, sound, and through the gamer's physical interaction with the game and all its aspects, from control handling to reaction of scenes unfolding on the screen. Besides still playing point-and-click or shoot-'em-up games, I'm trying my hand at games that are rich in narrative. Some of these games offer seemingly endless turns and twists based on the gamer's decisions, or they offer gamers multiple storylines or multiverses, essentially visual and immersive slipstream literature-style narratives within the games. These types of games began to shake up my perception of narrative and writing structure. Games like The Walking Dead, The Last of Us, and BioShock challenge the linear, chronological order of storytelling that's seen in many Eurocentric-styled literatures. Some of these video games remind me of Latin American literature, especially from the El Boom period, literature that explores life and being human and told in non-linear or circular fashions. One of my favorite Latin American books is the brilliant Pedro Páramo by Juan Rulfo, wherein the Mexican identity is examined through characters simultaneously living on multiple planes of existence. Another is the novel Hopscotch by Julio Cortázar that can be read following the chronological order of chapters or by hopscotching around and reading the chapters out of linear order to gain a different story. Since I love these mind-bending literary texts, it's only natural that I gravitate towards similarly styled games. But because the video games are multimodal, their narratives offer so much more than a book's narrative does on a printed two-dimensional page. I've noticed that the more I play video games, especially the ones whose narrative progression depends on the choices I make, the more expansive narrative becomes for me. I've moved out of, or rather beyond, the traditional perspective of narrative. The traditional perspective of narrative is that it's a linear, chronological ordering of events, thoughts, and ideas. My growing perspective of narrative is one that's more encompassing, more circular, more immersive. My perception of narrative structure is one based on making connections that are always on the move. It's like juggling bubbles, fragile, delicate soap bubbles that contain a multiverse of possibilities of ideas, events, thoughts. These bubbles are always drifting, always circling above my head. Yet, with enough concentration, I can still grasp them as long as I don't try too hard or grasp too hard. Often it's like looking at one of those paintings that on the surface are filled with dots, but when you unfocus your eyes, you begin to see patterns emerge, and those patterns create pictures or stories. Even my writing process has taken on this quality. My writing process has morphed from outlines, whether they were full-on sentence outlines or simply a rough draft of hastily jotted down ideas, to mind mapping and clustering. When using outlines, I find my ideas to be constrained by their linear positionality. In other words, my thinking through a particularly complex idea was limited to a linear progression of cause and effect, or chronological occurrence. But mind mapping, a generative activity that mirrors the types of video games I tend to play, allows me to move beyond the linear progression of thinking. Whether my mind mapping is formalized and limiting because of software, or wonderfully free form, I now favor a circular, more immersive way of thinking and writing about my subject. I now know those possibilities of ideas, events, thoughts, and their seemingly random connections to other possibilities are out there, just above my head, and waiting for me to grasp them and make them mine. But I still like to play my shoot 'em up games.